Okay, welcome back for our last but not least presentation by Kirsten DeMelo. Kirsten was born and raised in the USA. She is a second-generation Spiritist and active board member of the Spiritist Society of Baltimore. She coordinates meetings and gives talks on various Spiritist subjects. She's an active collaborator with the Spiritist movement in the USA, and professionally she is a registered nurse specialized in case management. Welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and listening. Truly, it's hard to speak being the last speaker of the day and to follow two wonderful talks, and all the talks this weekend have been amazing. What we felt intuitively to say was that how important it is that we are here together, speaking the language of this great country, not only for ourselves, but the vast amount of spirits that are brought here that aren't of such a highly elevated stage that they're able to dominate multiple languages or even cross that barrier, but who are so closer to the earth more than anything else and still need to hear the language they once spoke. So we thank you for all of those who are from Brazil or some other area in the world and who make that genuine and kind contribution to English speakers, because we know that it's not easy, it must not be easy, I don't know personally, to speak a language that is not your own. Because I felt the need to sort of tell a little bit something personal about myself, as Christy has thus inspired us through the mentors as well, that I, although grew up in a Spiritist family, didn't choose to be a Spiritist merely because I grew up in a Spiritist family, because my siblings did not follow suit of what I'm doing here today. But I followed a woman who, for me, was an embodiment of the teachings, and I could see in her everyday actions and the things that she said to people when she would counsel them, and how moved they were, and how by being around her they were moved, and thus that moved me as a child and as a young adult, because I thought I wanted to be like that. I wanted to be with someone and they left my presence feeling more whole or closer to becoming whole, because there are so many broken people in this world. And that woman is my mother, and I owed her my life and gratitude for bringing me this knowledge, because English was not and is not her first language. And growing up, she struggled to utter sentences, but she spent night and day translating things for her 4 children, because she wanted to ensure that they felt the peace in their hearts as she has her whole life. Because when we talk about a subject like guilt, it is painful. And every person to some degree or another has felt that pain, whether it's in this current life or perhaps you feel an unknown guilt from a previous life that has come to you somehow. But the most amazing thing that Spiritism has taught us is that no matter what you have done or what you have been through, you can face that with the help of your personal trainer, your guide, and be able to endure the things of your life. Now, we know there's modern definitions of what guilt is, and then there's the definition that Spiritism also enlightens us with. So today we're going to be talking about the definitions of guilt, how to overcome guilt from a Spiritist perspective, and true cases on people, what happens to us when we allow that sensation of guilt to ruminate. One thing for sure, before we even bring the definitions of what guilt means, we want to try to live our life in such a way as when Christ was here living on earth. But not the Jesus that was on the cross, not the Jesus that we were taught about, hell, brimstone, and fire and all of those things, but a different Jesus. A Jesus that makes you feel comfortable with who you are, who can allow you to feel like you have the possibility of being something greater than what you are in the moment or where you may find yourself. So, although we may currently find ourselves in a situation with these emotions of guilt, of which Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as such, the fact of having committed a breach of conduct, especially violating law and involving a penalty, So it's not a nice feeling necessarily when we have guilt. It really isn't. It's seen as something negative in its nature, right? Whenever you hear the word guilt, you think of a criminal, maybe. But how many of us can even live with little things we've done perhaps in years prior? Has anybody never done anything that they've regretted? Or does anyone? Probably okay, everybody has, at least to some degree. Have you all had the opportunity to make amends? You think, maybe, sort of, kind of, hopefully? You tried? You gave it your best shot? Hopefully it'll work out in the end for you? Well, it will. With an ardent desire to change, you can. It might take time. But the beautiful thing today, and one of the things we're going to be touching on, is a book that was psychographed by the Brazilian medium, Divaldo Franco, through the Spirit, Joanna de Angelis, who we ourselves have respectfully deemed her the Spiritist psychologist. But she is a psychologist with warmth and kindness and non-judgment, but is there like a good professor and mother who lovingly teaches and guides. And she states the following: the guilt in this particular book, Existential Conflicts, she has a whole chapter, and basically the whole book talks about some major emotions in our lives that can either be good or bad. She talks about love, and she talks about guilt, and she talks about fear and anger, and she talks about it in such a dynamic where she talks about the psychology of guilt, what happens when we stay with guilt, and ways to overcome it. She talks about each emotion that way, because emotions are an interesting thing. So let me give you an example of how emotion works in our life in a more tangible perspective, or conceptually you can understand it. For instance, if I walk off the stage and I fall, right, most likely I will hurt or bruise a part of my body. That is good. Although you might say, I'm going to wind up with a big bruise on my leg or perhaps on my arm, but that is my body telling me and the nerves communicating to my brain that something's wrong. Now, if I were a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, my body wouldn't have the ability to communicate to my brain, if I were to fall off my wheelchair, that I hurt a part of my body. We had a patient once who was a paraplegic, who she thought, that she was at home with her husband, everything she thought was, her husband thought everything was okay. They went to bed, they woke up the next day, and she had passed away in her sleep. And when they did an autopsy and all types of things, they realized that she had had some things go internally wrong with her, that had she had the sensation of the lower parts of her body, she would have been alerted to tell her husband, take me to the hospital. But since she didn't have the sensation, she didn't know. So our emotions are kind of the same way. They're an alert for us to let us know where we are at on our pathway, and we shouldn't take that for granted, because God has created us in such a way to alert us constantly of where we're at in life. When Dr. Broca, who is that man who is scientist, researcher, who's famous for basically finding out the area in the brain, which we now call Broca. You guys can Google it, look more into it. But he probably had no idea the implications of what he had discovered. That our brain, which God created, we are created in such a way to express emotion and to feel emotion. Thus, we are created this way. So why not use the very structure of how God created us as a tool for my own happiness? Because as Andrea was sharing, within us, right within us, we have the means to become better. And I'm not just talking about losing weight, looking beautiful. I'm talking about inner joy, the kind of joy where you can walk out into public with your pajamas on and your hair, your makeup's not on, yet you feel fantastic. And I remember a very dear friend of mine once said to me, in one of my more lowlier days of my life years ago, and she said, Kirsten, you have to build an inner temple inside of yourself, and no matter what you look like or how you feel, you got to talk to yourself and say, I'm a child of God. This is a blessing. And although she kind of had a little bit of eccentric behavior, I thought, that is really good. I like that, because she always was happy, or she seemed so. I began instituting that, and I actually began to do this trial with myself, because I found that naturally wasn't happening, so we began to actually go out on purpose without doing our hair and putting makeup on and not wearing the most nicest clothes, but because we wanted to force our mind. So just a little tool that you can utilize. But getting back a little bit of the science of emotion and research, it's really interesting, again, that guilt, that science has already been finding amongst many other emotions that exist out there. And there's the book I had mentioned, that guilt actually is a self-regulatory mechanism. Some research is saying. So it's very interesting because they're saying that guilt is good because, and I'm going to put the psychopathic people over to the side in the corner of the room for a moment because this isn't necessarily applied to them. But guilt, for those of us who have our awakened conscience, when we do something wrong and we feel bad for it, it's a self-regulatory mechanism. We say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That's good. Guilt, we will find, and I hope through the end of this lecture, is only bad when you're unable to forgive yourself of what you've done. And that is a huge impediment. And we are the largest impediment to our own happiness. We may say, oh, it's my significant other. Oh, it's my mother-in-law. Oh, it's my whoever. But really, it's us. Really, it's us. A beautiful quote from the Spirit's book that Paul the Apostle, of which we are quite biased of, because we find his personal story extremely moving, because Paul should have, if we know, for those of you who don't know a whole lot about Paul the Apostle, you can read about it in the Old Testament and New Testament about Paul, who once lived as Saul. Saul was pretty much a doctor of the law back in the time of Romans and the Hebrews, in Jesus' time. Slightly after, he was an apostle. He became a convert. Those of you, I think you all know the story, right? Okay. But before he became Paul, he was a murderer. He would murder women and children. He actually got the right from the authorities of the time to kill Christian, because at that time, they weren't necessarily killing women yet, but he got the authority to start that. So he should have had an immense amount of guilt that he carried around. But because he wholeheartedly made this huge shift in his life, once he accepted this light into his life, he began repairing everything by going out and preaching. And it wasn't easy for him. He was stoned and spit on and despised. His family abandoned him. How many of us today could deal with that? If your family abandoned you, people spit on you when you spoke, nobody accepted you, and people thought you had gone raving mad. Could you deal with that, those on your shoulders? And on top of that, oh, by the way, you were a murderer as well. You killed women and you helped orchestrate that. But Paul said something beautiful that shows us our relation of our emotions to God and our evolutionary path. He says the following: those who through a transgression, through a wrong impulse of the soul, have distanced themselves from the objective of their creation, which consists in the desire for goodness and beauty, as idealized by the human embodiment of perfection, the divine model, Jesus Christ. But I wish again to make an emphasis, because for centuries, we have been misrepresenting the Jesus that I wish I could share with you, that is in my heart. That it is not the Jesus that condemns, it is not the Jesus that is necessarily preached in the churches, although maybe today it's different because the time that we had gone was of a different era. But an all-embracing and loving governor of this planet. Remember that the man who also said this also was on a pathway to redemption. And he really says a lot because he speaks from his heart here, because what he lived this. He's saying here that he was that person that had distanced himself. Because in his mind, being Jewish, Saul was Jewish, he followed Judaism, he thought he was doing God's will. He thought he was doing right. Came to find out that he was not. But as soon as he found out that he wasn't. He switched. He made a shift in his life. And that's what we hope, that even though this room, physically speaking, holds less than 20 people, there are a multitude of souls that are here and that will be sent here as well. We just need to continue to share this be the embodiment that Christ wanted us to be. Because we don't know how many lives Christy has already touched by telling her story and showing how she lives, how Bean has shown his love and kindness, how that has moved people without even knowing it in our life. Because Joanna Giannis tells us that we should not only, understand the literature, the teachings, not only read, be able to share with others, but she said, you must feel it. How do you feel this? Unless sometimes if you actually endure a hardship and then you know what it feels like. There's no denying that. But that's when we begin to serve as a testimony. When you become that embodiment. Have you ever been around someone who you just felt so good to be around? Like the person's just so loving, kind, and gentle. You just want to be like them, or you just want to be around them all the time because they are a living book. And that's what we hope to do in our life. Joanna DeAndres in the book Existential Conflicts, she tells us that guilt, more or less, because she generalizes here, where it comes from. She says the following. Oh, and let me put a disclaimer here as well, since we know that there are some psychologists in the room, that this lecture is not meant to touch on modern day psychology in its entirety, but because this is a Spiritist lecture, we'll be touching from the Spiritist perspective. But of course, this lecture can be given for weeks on end, all about it. So forgive us if we do not cover every last detail. But we hope and believe we are being inspired by the great mind who psychographed this book and the great mind, the spirit, Joanna DeAndres, in this moment. Joanna tells us that guilt is derived from past experiences, whether in this current life or past lives. She also says in childhood, what we learn, obviously we can be conditioned. Pavlov, the great researcher decades ago, taught us that we can be conditioned into believing and feeling certain things, and we'll talk about an actual case and research later about that very topic. So we can be conditioned from birth to feel guilty for things that we're not even really guilty for, or ways that our parents have taught us, or things recently we have done or in previous lives. When I gave this lecture, probably over a year ago, a young woman approached me, and it was very interesting, and because we're going to touch on this, and Joanna touches on this, she said, I actually feel guilty and have since I was a child, but I don't know why. My parents are Spiritists. I have no apparent reason to feel it. I've never done anything in this life, per her, to really feel guilty, so I'm not really sure. So it's interesting. We know that it is real, this sensation of having guilt from some place in time where we're not really sure of. But in that case, it's always recommended to go and reevaluate that person's life, that the person should reevaluate their life and begin changing the relationships in their life for the better. Start trying to build more of charitable behavior, because perhaps the very people we're in our current life with, not perhaps for sure, are our old accomplices or people whom we have debts with. So perhaps we're not being aware enough of what's going on, and spirituality allows that emotion to pop up, to manifest itself, to call our attention. Again, if I bang my hand against this thing, I assure you I will feel some pain. So our emotions work in the same way. Joanna DeAndres says the psychology of guilt works like this, in the cascade format. She says, when it's being formed, rather. She says that guilt obviously first starts with an action. She says the damage done against another. Obviously, you have to go and do something in order to feel that way. Okay, makes sense. Then she says the madness, the anger, hate, or desire for revenge, it blinds us. So I go and I commit an act out of rage or anger or jealousy or whatever it is, completely blinds a person. Then at some point, remorse the awareness of the mistake made, but no courage to fix it. This unresolved guilt, if this unresolved emotion turns into guilt, so we go from remorse to guilt, becomes archived in the spirit. In other literature, they refer to this as being as a crystallization in your being. When we don't resolve it, then what happens? Well, one or two things happen. And I'll share with you a true story. Actually, it happened in the news in Baltimore, Maryland, and the only reason I kind of feel a little bit close to the story is because it happened with an ex-coworker. She had looked for, I'll try to tell this briefly, she had looked for love her whole life, married multiple times, had several children. She found a man who she thought was the love of her life, as she soon found out after a year of marriage that wasn't love at all, and he became abusive, so she attempted to separate from him. And in this process of separation, one morning recently, she's putting her 3-year-old son into her car. Her ex-husband came up to her, shot her point-blank range in her chest, and killed her. When he got home that very day, I assure you, the pang of remorse hit his heart like a million bricks because he turned the shotgun on himself and killed himself. Police, obviously, after a number of hours of finding her body, not a number of hours, right away they found her body. Within a number of hours, of course, they were led to him, to his home, and found out murder-suicide. There's an exact same story or similar story that I told about yesterday. I mentioned one of the stories from the book Memoirs of a Suicide, where they detail this a very case just like that and what happens, the desperation, the spirit in the book. And I recommend you to go and read it as I did yesterday. And what he felt, this particular spirit, after he killed himself. Because when we cut short our life, it's not a pretty thing once we reach the other side. Because our vital fluid isn't basically, it's still there. It's still very connected to our physical body. We are still very connected to our physical body. So for instance, if my reincarnatory plan, I was meant to pass away, let's say at age 62, and I end my life at 33, for the number of years that I was, generally speaking, in every case is a different case, that time period I was supposed to stay alive for, I might have the great chance I would suffer on the other side for that period of time, depending upon the spirit himself. And every case is a case, really we shouldn't generalize. But as Andrea had mentioned, the book Evolution in Two Worlds, which, praise God, will be coming out in English, it is fascinating, this book. Let me tell you why. In the introduction of this book, I'm going to give it away, I'm sorry. They say something that when we first read it, because we had studied it in our group, but we translated it into English while we were studying it, that I was like, what? Why didn't they put that in the introduction? Because they dedicate the book. Because mind you, let me tell you, the book is very scientific. And that's why Andrea made the comment, like, I don't even attempt to read the book, because even for people who read Portuguese, it's extremely complex. But they dedicate this book to people who are suffering, to souls who are tormented. And after, I'd say, we got to chapter 3, I realized why they dedicated that book to those who go through pain and suffering. Because when you read that book and you realize how small you are, not in a negative way, but how what we think is our problems are so big, when you realize the amount of time and love that God puts into every single minute creature on this planet, you realize that there's something so much greater going on here that your problems become infinitesimally smaller. And you do not suffer nearly as much as what you had before. We were changed dramatically after we read this book. So I am very happy to say it'll be coming out in English soon. And don't just recommend it for those who are of a scientific background, but all people, because it's meant for everybody. But what happens to us when we keep this guilt within us? Well, we're going to talk about a real case later today, but one of which, either if I committed the wrong in this current life, one or two things can happen. If I had the sheer luck quote unquote luck, of not being caught. I'll tell you a case from the book, And Life Goes On. There was a man who was, his best friend was engaged to a woman whom he was in love with. So he created this whole plot, long story short, because I don't have a whole lot of time here. He basically killed his best friend to be with his friend's fiancée, girlfriend. And he wound up marrying her. Everybody thought his best friend committed suicide, even his wife. So it was all good. He married his wife. They were apparently happy. They had some kids. But every now and then, he would be triggered by the ideas that he remembered what he did. So throughout his whole life, he never could find true happiness. Because although there were periods where he could forget, it would bubble up within him like acid reflux does every now and then and would remind him of what he did. And it would imprison him in his own self. And that's what happened. It pushed him to what the time that the book was written, or rather the time frame that the context of the book was in a time period where science didn't refer to depression as depression, but more so melancholy, bouts of melancholy. And that's what he had. With modern terms, we would say he had depression because of what he had done. Once you reach this stage where you feel guilty, you feel discomfort, you feel distress, and that's also what this particular character in the book, And Life Goes On, felt. And he also felt very afflicted and undervalued. And Joanna DeAndres, because this is the structure in which she says if guilt stays with you, it'll push you to depression because you can't even fathom or deal with what's going on in your mind. You feel this constant worry of being found out, so you're distrustful of people. And you feel afflicted and undervalued because you don't value yourself. And you have these thoughts of self-punishment. That's why a lot of people who have guilt kill themselves, thinking that I'm going to end it. Just cut my life short and it'll go away. But the sad reality of that is they continue to have the same pain they did when they cross over, except now they have the pain of the sensation of how they ended their life. And the cycle just continues and goes on until some point in your life you put a stop to it. True case from a book that will also very soon be published in English. It's called Torments of Obsession. Now the book primarily, it talks about a colony, actually a spirit hospital. It's called Hospital Esperança in the spirit realm, that was founded by a great Brazilian spiritist medium that lived in I believe it was like the early 1900s. His name is Euripides Barçanufo. If you don't know about him, I recommend you Googling him. He has an amazing story, and I don't have the time enough to talk about him. But in any way, in the book, Torments of Obsession, they study a case of a man named Evaldo. Now, remember how I told you that in the book, it basically is all about how spiritists wind up at this spiritist hospital called Hospital Esperança. Because when Euripides Barçanufo passed on to the spirit realm, he discarnated, he found that a lot of spiritists were discarnating in deplorable situations, because the more knowledge, more information you're given, the more you know, the more is expected of you, because our own conscious calls our attention, right? It's redundant. I don't have to share with you guys that. So he created, along with many helpers in the spirit realm, this hospital for spiritists to go to. One of the cases that the spirit, Manuel Filomena de Miranda, he's the one who psychographs the book through the hands of Divaldo Franco. He details for us this case that we're going to be studying today, Evaldo. Evaldo was a man who for almost, I believe it was 30 years, who had prepared himself in the spirit realm to be born into a loving spiritist family, to prepare himself for a life in politics. And his plan was all set for him. And it went well in the beginning. He, was born, he had loving parents, loving spiritists. They were the kind of spiritists that really lived it So he had great experiences, and he met his wife, and she was wonderful and loving and caring and very spiritual. So he was doing good, and he was very successful in his career. He became a politician in Brazil, and things were going great for him. In his childhood, he had some challenges because he had, periods where he had night terrors because some of his obsessors were trying to, get to him. But because his parents were spiritists, they brought him to the center. He received passes, and he was okay, relatively speaking. But when he got to his adult years, got married, had children of his own, when he started to become more into his career and more, I would say, popular, he began making excuses why he didn't have time to go to his spiritist center. Oh, I'm a busy politician. I'm going on business. I have this to do. And pretty soon, he was engaged in extramarital affairs. His wife, within 3 years, died of cancer, or maybe even less. And after she died, he was devastated. He came to the realization, because he had some unconscious notion that he had completely gone off track. And he died in a deplorable situation, of which they depict in the story that he had began, due to his deep depression and guilt of what he had done, because he felt that he had killed his wife, he had caused this cancer, while he was still incarnated in this mode of depression and guilt and sadness, they tell us, the doctors in this book say that he began emanating from his crown chakra these dark emanations to a point where it formed a cocoon all around him, that even in the book, Manuel Filomena de Miranda was like, oh my gosh. And that they had to do special surgery. Special surgeons come in just to cut delicately around the cocoon, around his face area. And when they moved the cocoon, and they could see where this was all being generated, is being generated from himself. And it was a shock. Like, he's doing that to himself? Of course, he had obsessors over a period of time that were egging him on, but he himself carried that guilt. And we say this because, yes, in his life he veered off the beaten path, but he also exacerbated his situation by continuing on with that emotion of guilt. So although it can be a good emotion to show us that, no, you shouldn't do this, but it also is an opportunity for us to realize that we shouldn't stay with it. And one way to help us with that guilt, we would say, depending upon what has happened to you in your life, for example, we've had women come to us who have talked about that they've either, committed abortions or had, abandoned their children at some point, and they wanted to make amends, but it was too late. Either the children were someplace they couldn't find. So we recommend, well, go volunteer with children at the children's hospital. Find a way to give back to the same area of which you had perhaps not made the best decisions in life. Give back to them, those people. There's a really interesting research on guilt that they had studied a group of 20 Caucasians, and they had given them different photos to look at. And they had wired them up to a system and had been taking MRIs of them, except they didn't tell them what kind of research they were doing. But after it was all said and done, they told some of the participants that, I'm sorry to tell you, person A, B, and C, that our documentation is showing that every time you looked at an African American, basically all the scans show that you're a racist. And those people were appalled at that. But it was interesting because the research had shown that the people who thought they were guilty of being a racist, when the researchers were offering material of how to be more culturally sensitive, those few people were the very ones who wanted to do everything in their power to become more self-aware. So it's interesting, more so not because of the ending, but because we can be conditioned to believe we are guilty for something that we aren't necessarily. So it's interesting because in this case, Evelina kind of touches on that in this particular book we mentioned earlier, And Life Goes On. Evelina, she was the woman who those two men were fighting over. Remember, her late husband, had killed the best friend, who was her previous fiancé, she also felt some guilt because she, thinking that her ex-fiancé killed himself when in fact her current husband actually murdered him, she felt some sort of guilt. And the good and noble spirituality had come to this agreement to help her. That because she was emanating these feelings, these mental waves of remorse for participating in this supposed suicide, what did they do? They allowed this spirit to be attracted to her womb, so she got pregnant. But this particular spirit was a spirit who had previously committed suicide and needed the trial of a miscarriage to appreciate life. So what happened? She had a miscarriage. So it not only helped her to get rid of part of that deep, profound guilt she had, but this spirit who also had some debts also, even though she wasn't entirely guilty, although she played a part, not in his death necessarily, but the fact that she had misled him before, because she also was torn between the two men. But go and read the book. It's very good. So we see the mercy of God, because together they had released and paid off their debt. It was beautiful. So these are the tips I want to leave you with more than anything else, either for yourself or to share with someone in your life at some point in time who feels bad for something they have done in their life. These are very basic, and we learned through another friend of ours, a doctor, who said that through research he has learned that when you give patients too many things to do, they wind up not doing any of them. So research has shown just give them 2 to 3 things. That at least they'll follow, the most important of all. So through guidance, we felt these were some of the most important ones you could take home today, and you can also find them in the book Existential Conflicts. The part of our healing process with guilt is the courage to ask for forgiveness. And that is extremely hard. When you have to face the very person who you hurt and you feel bad for it, it's difficult. It's beyond difficult because your ego is completely hurt and crushed, your pride, and perhaps you're even fearful what that person may do depending upon what you have done. But we must muster up the courage to forgive ourselves and to forgive others. She also talks about putting right what was done incorrectly. As I mentioned earlier today about the case where several women have come up to us over the years, and what do I do? My younger years when I was, living life to the fullest, and I made some bad decisions in regards to pregnancy, and I had some, abortion. What do I do now? Well, go make amends by working with other children who perhaps were abandoned. Learn to love others, love other people's children, because through that charitable act, we already know science through the research that Dr. Stephen Post has done. He wrote a book, It Is Good to Be Good. Amazing research that was done that physiologically, emotionally, and psychologically, it is good for us to be charitable. Always. Love yourself and love therapy. This is interesting because that's a whole lecture in and of itself. But if you can create a habit of looking at yourself every day in the morning, as you are, no makeup, pajamas, hair's not done, or if you're bald, I guess it doesn't matter, whatever, but just saying, I love you. You're not perfect, but I love you. You're almost there. You're getting there. It seems silly and ridiculous, but we have to create some type of mantra because there's a little book that was also psychographed by the same spirit, Joanna DeAngelis, and one of the messages she says, learn to love yourself a little bit more, and that's a direct quote. And we really reflected about that for weeks, like, why does she say a little bit more? Because perhaps our conception, or rather our idea of what it is to love ourselves still isn't enough. We need to learn to love ourselves a little bit more, not in a materialistic sense where we go on shopping sprees and all this kinds of business, not that, although it's not bad to shop, it's necessary, we're human, but loving who we are, even with all of our errors. Because rest assured, if you can forgive yourself, if you can love yourself, you can do so with others. And that is why we recommend you taking a second look at Jesus, not from this old hell, fire and brimstone perspective, but from a broader perspective of a Jesus who, even though Judas had supposedly betrayed him, when Judas killed himself and hung himself, who was there to meet him when he passed on? The great Master. Dear friends, I wish you all the happiness that this world can bring you. Go and read, be amongst the Spiritist Center or other religious aspects, any way to bring you closer to your spiritual purpose in life, because that is the ultimate goal of all of us. Thank you so much, and God bless us all.